Emily Thompson had always been seen as the ideal daughter. Smart, quiet, respectful. She was the kind of girl every parent wished for. In her small Ohio town, people often praised Karen Thompson for raising such a remarkable young woman all on her own. Karen worked tirelessly as a nurse, sometimes pulling 12-hour shifts, just to make sure Emily never lacked anything. She proudly told anyone who would listen that her daughter was going to be a doctor. Photos of Emily in a white coat standing in front of her college campus were proudly framed in the living room. Her Facebook profile was filled with honor, roll certificates and smiling selfies from what looked like campus libraries and biology labs. But behind the perfectly staged photos and glowing updates was a reality that Karen never saw coming. A year before her expected graduation, Emily's life had quietly fallen apart. Overwhelmed by the intense pressure of her pre-med program, she began to struggle with her grades. What started as a few missed assignments quickly turned into failed exams, and soon she was on academic probation. Instead of telling her mother, Emily panicked. She dropped out without telling anyone, hoping she could find a way to fix everything before the truth came out. But as time passed, her lies grew bigger and more complicated. Emily had always been a quiet person. She didn't have many close friends, and the ones she had slowly drifted away when she stopped attending classes and campus events. She would spend entire days locked in her dorm room, glued to her computer screen, editing fake university emails, fabricating transcripts, and photoshopping pictures of herself at supposed medical conferences. The few people who saw her during that time described her as withdrawn, tired, and nervous. But most didn't think much of it. Everyone believed she was just a dedicated student, buried in her studies. She even created a fake graduation timeline that she shared with her mother, carefully listing out each step, from her final exams to gown pickup. Karen, filled with excitement, marked the date on her calendar and began making plans. She talked about flying in relatives, ordering decorations, and buying a special gift to mark her daughter's big day. Emily smiled and nodded along, her heart racing with guilt and fear. As graduation day approached, Karen's excitement only grew. She began sharing more posts about her daughter's upcoming achievement and started saving money for a post-graduation vacation to celebrate. She spoke with pride about how Emily would be the first in their family to become a doctor. All the while, Emily knew the clock was ticking. Every passing day brought her closer to exposure. The lies she had been carefully spinning for months were beginning to close in on her, and she had no idea how to stop what was coming. In her mind, she had built a world too big to escape and too dangerous to let fall apart. As the days drew closer to the fake graduation, Emily's anxiety grew unbearable. The walls of her dorm room felt like they were closing in, and every text or phone call from her mother sent a pang of dread through her chest. Karen had started asking more direct questions. "Have you confirmed the final schedule for graduation?" she would ask. "Did you get your cap and gown yet?" Emily's responses were increasingly evasive, her excuses more strained. She had promised Karen that everything was taken care of, but in reality, Emily hadn't even begun to think about the logistical side of things. Her heart pounded each time her mother made another excited comment about the event. Karen had even mentioned inviting friends from work and other relatives, many of whom hadn't seen Emily in years. She talked about how proud she was of her daughter for persevering through her studies, unaware that her daughter hadn't attended a single class in more than a year. The weight of the deception started to feel unbearable. But Emily kept up the charade, telling herself that just a little longer and everything would be fine. But deep down, Emily knew it was all about to collapse. She was running out of time. The graduation date was a ticking clock she couldn't silence. Every time she thought about it, her stomach twisted in knots. Emily had tried everything she could think of to avoid the truth coming out. She created fake grades, forged emails from professors saying she was on track to graduate, and even made up a story about an internship she had been working at a hospital. The lies had become so intricate that even she sometimes had trouble keeping track of what was real and what was fabricated. The thought of coming clean to Karen was unfathomable. Karen had always been so proud of her, always boasting about how Emily would one day be a doctor. She had sacrificed everything to give her daughter a future. The thought of shattering that image, of watching the pride in her mother's eyes, turn to heartbreak, was something Emily couldn't bear to imagine. One evening, Karen called to ask about Emily's final exams, and it was then that Emily began to panic. Karen had heard from a few other parents that their children had already completed their exams and were getting ready for the graduation ceremony. Karen mentioned she was planning to contact the university directly to confirm the details of Emily's graduation, and that was when the panic hit its peak. Emily's stomach lurched as she realized that her mother would soon uncover the truth. Karen would know she hadn't even been enrolled in classes, that Emily had lied about every single aspect of her college life. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She stayed awake, pacing her room, her mind racing through every possible way she could hide the truth. But the lies were no longer enough to protect her. The closer the graduation date came, the more impossible it seemed to keep pretending. She had reached a breaking point. The weight of her deception was too heavy, and every step she took toward the finish line felt like a step toward disaster. Desperation clawed at her. She had to do something to stop the inevitable. The thought of her mother finding out everything, of seeing her face when she learned the truth, filled Emily with dread. The fear of losing everything was too much to bear. Emily felt trapped, and in her mind, there was only one way out. The night Karen was killed started like any other. Emily arrived at her mother's house just after sunset, having told Karen that she was visiting for the weekend. Karen had just gotten home from her late-night shift at the hospital, exhausted but still smiling. She offered Emily a cup of tea, as she always did, and the two of them sat in the living room, chatting about mundane things. Small talk about Karen's long hours at work and Emily's made-up plans for the future. But beneath the surface, Emily's mind was in turmoil. The pressure was suffocating. The walls of lies, built carefully over the past year, were closing in. Every word that came out of her mouth felt like a lie. Every glance from her mother felt like judgment. Emily's stomach churned, and she couldn't escape the sense of impending doom. She had to act, and she had to act fast. Karen had no idea that this quiet evening would be her last. Emily had planned everything meticulously, but there was no way to prepare for the horror of what she was about to do. The evening wore on, and as the clock ticked closer to midnight, Karen began to grow sleepy. She excused herself and went to her bedroom, leaving Emily alone in the living room. For a moment, everything felt eerily calm. But for Emily, the stillness only made the anxiety worse. The weight of her secret, of the deception, seemed to suffocate her with every breath. It was then that Emily made her decision. The thought had crossed her mind many times in the weeks leading up to this moment. But tonight, the fear of exposure finally pushed her over the edge. Emily stood up and walked quietly toward the kitchen, her heart racing. In the drawer she knew where Karen kept the heavy wooden rolling pin. Emily grabbed it with trembling hands, the cool wood feeling almost foreign in her grip. She didn't think. She just acted. Without hesitation, she walked to Karen's bedroom, where her mother had already begun to doze off in bed. The quiet of the room seemed to amplify the chaos inside Emily's mind. She raised the rolling pin, her breath shallow, and brought it down with brutal force onto Karen's head. The impact was sickening, a sharp crack that echoed through the stillness of the house. Karen jolted awake, but before she could react, Emily struck again and again and again. The sound of the blows was muffled by the thick walls of the house, but the violence was unmistakable. Karen never had a chance. Her body lay motionless on the bed, blood pooling around her as Emily stood over her, breathing heavily, her hands trembling. For a long moment, Emily couldn't move. She stared at the lifeless body of the woman who had given everything for her, who had loved her unconditionally. It felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't escape. But there was no going back. The deed was done. Emily stepped away, her feet slick with blood, her mind numb. The reality of what she had just done started to settle in, but there was no time to process it. There was only one thing left to do. She quickly cleaned up, wiping down the surfaces and ensuring there were no signs of struggle. The house had to look untouched, as if nothing had happened at all. Once she was sure everything appeared normal, Emily slipped out of the house, leaving the front door slightly ajar. She walked into the cool night, her heart racing, her mind in a fog of shock and terror. She returned to her dorm room, as though nothing had changed. But the truth was, everything had changed. Emily had crossed a line that could never be undone. The world she had built, full of lies and pretenses, was now stained with blood, and there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. The discovery of Karen's body sent shockwaves through the small town. The neighbor who hadn't seen Karen leave for work in the morning was the one who first grew suspicious. She called the police after noticing the front door slightly ajar, an unusual sight in a neighborhood where people kept their homes locked tight. When the officers arrived, they found the door unlocked and the house eerily quiet. It didn't take long for them to find Karen in her bedroom, her body cold and lifeless. The scene was horrifying, a brutal attack, the kind that left investigators wondering who could have committed such a vicious crime. Emily was already in the center of the investigation. The police arrived at her dorm that morning, looking for answers. They had heard she was the last person to see her mother alive. Emily, still in shock, put on her best act of grief. She sobbed, her face pale, trembling as she recounted her last moments with Karen. She claimed she had visited the house in the evening, as she often did, and after their brief conversation she had gone to bed early, unable to stay awake due to exhaustion from her studies. Emily stuck to her story, carefully crafted with a mix of emotion and confusion. She couldn't understand how something so terrible could happen. The detectives were polite but thorough. They didn't believe her from the start. They had learned that Emily had been under a lot of pressure lately, especially with her graduation approaching. They began to piece together inconsistencies in her story. The first clue was the timeline. Karen's co-worker confirmed that Karen had gotten home at around 9 p.m., but Emily had told investigators she arrived after 11 p.m., creating a gap in her whereabouts. The discrepancy raised questions, but it wasn't enough to pin her as a suspect. Just yet. As the investigation progressed, the detectives uncovered more unsettling details. They discovered that Emily had not been attending classes for a long time. The university had no records of her recent enrollments or participation in any of her supposed courses. Her fabricated transcripts were just that, fabrications. Emily's mother had been under the impression that her daughter was still in school, but in reality, Emily had dropped out more than a year ago. This revelation shocked the investigators. They knew then that there was more to the story than they had initially thought. The pressure on Emily continued to mount. When they questioned her further, they found her increasingly evasive, almost as if she were trying to avoid certain topics. The most troubling detail came when they reviewed security footage from the neighborhood. Cameras had captured a figure matching Emily's appearance entering the house late that night. And most damning of all, footage showed her leaving the house early the next morning, looking strangely calm. The detectives decided to confront Emily with the evidence. As they laid out the facts, the forged documents, the false stories, and the damning footage, Emily's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Her hands trembled as she admitted to the lies she had told her mother, but she still denied any involvement in her mother's death. However, when the detectives pushed her further, she finally broke down. The confession came slowly, her words hesitant and filled with guilt. Emily admitted to the murder, but the reasons behind it were chilling. She had been terrified that her mother would find out the truth, that Emily was nothing more than a failure, a fraud, and a liar. The thought of losing her mother's love, of seeing the disappointment in Karen's eyes, was too much to bear. So, in a moment of panic, Emily had made the unimaginable choice to end her mother's life. The weight of the confession hung in the air, a mix of relief and horror. Emily's carefully constructed world had fallen apart, and with it, the woman who had loved her unconditionally. The detectives left the room, the reality of the case setting in. Emily had confessed, but the town would never be the same again. The murder of Karen Thompson wasn't just the loss of a mother, it was the death of a dream, of the perfect daughter, who had been anything but. The trial of Emily Thompson captivated the nation. The story of a bright, promising young woman who had murdered her own mother to cover up a web of lies left many shocked and horrified. News outlets picked up the case, with some focusing on the shock of the crime, while others delved deeper into the motivations that led to such a brutal act. In small-town Ohio, people struggled to reconcile the image of the perfect daughter they had all believed in with the reality of the cold-blooded killer standing trial before them. Emily's defense team tried to build a case around the idea of mental instability. They argued that the pressure of Emily's academic failure, combined with her fear of losing her mother's love and approval, had caused a temporary breakdown. They painted Emily as a young woman who had been overwhelmed by the expectations placed upon her, a girl who simply couldn't cope with the immense pressure to live up to her mother's dreams. The defense team highlighted her age, claiming that she was not fully mature and unable to comprehend the full consequences of her actions in that moment of panic. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of a calculated and deliberate crime. They showed the jury the details of Emily's deceit, from her forged transcripts and fake emails to the carefully crafted lies she had told her mother. They presented the evidence of the brutal attack on Karen, detailing how Emily had used a heavy rolling pin to strike her mother repeatedly, with no sign of remorse in her actions. They also pointed to Emily's calmness in the aftermath, how she had cleaned up the scene and pretended nothing had happened, all the while maintaining her facade of being the grieving daughter. The prosecution argued that Emily had planned the murder, knowing exactly what she was doing, even if the ultimate motive was rooted in fear and self-preservation. As the trial progressed, the jury was confronted with the complexity of Emily's psyche. They listened to testimony from college professors who described Emily as a bright student with great potential, someone who was well liked by her peers. But they also heard from friends and classmates who had seen her change over time, becoming more withdrawn and distant. Some testified that they had sensed something was wrong, but never imagined it could lead to something as extreme as murder. Emily's mental state was difficult to assess. Her actions seemed too calculated for a person suffering from temporary insanity. Yet the level of deception she had maintained for so long pointed to a deep internal conflict that no one had seen coming. In the end, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Emily's face remained stoic as the words were read aloud. Her defense team had hoped for a lesser charge, but the jury found that her actions had been both intentional and brutal. The judge sentenced Emily to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as the reality of her sentence set in. There would be no chance for redemption, no chance for Emily to make amends for the life she had taken. For the people of the town, the verdict brought little comfort. The grief over Karen's death was too great, and the community was left to grapple with the fact that the daughter who had once been the symbol of success and promise was now a convicted killer. Emily had stolen the life of the person who had given her everything, and in doing so, she had destroyed both her future and her mother's legacy. In the years that followed, the town slowly began to heal, but the memory of Karen Thompson and the dark truth about the daughter she had raised lingered in the minds of all who knew them. The case remained a haunting reminder of how deeply secrets can fester and how a life built on lies can unravel in the most tragic of ways.